So chapter 4, how to work with JavaScript, objects, functions, and events. We've been dealing with some of this already. The documents, the window stuff, those are objects. A couple functions here and there, and some events. Given the specifications for a JavaScript application that requires only the skill that you learned so far, code, test, and debug the application. Distinguish between these objects: windows, document, text box, number, date, and string. Describe the way number and string objects are created. Describe these methods of the window object: parse int, parse float. Like I said, we've been using a lot of this stuff already. Describe these methods of the document object: query selector all, and write. Describe these methods and properties of a text box object: focus, select, value, and disable. Some of the stuff, the focus and select and that stuff, we've seen some of it in C#. Describe the toFix method of a number object. We've been using that already. Describe the way date objects are created. Describe these methods of a date object: toDate string, get full year, get date, get month. We use some of this in C#. Like I said, a lot of this, once you learn it in one language, it carries over to a lot of other languages. Describe the length property of a string and the methods of a string: index of, substring, to lowercase and to uppercase. Describe the creation and use of a function, declaration, function expressions, and arrow functions. Distinguish between function expressions and arrow functions. Distinguish between global scope, local scope, and block scope. And again, like the scope parts, we've used some of that already in C#. So some of this may just be a refresher for you. Describe how to create and attach event handlers, including how to attach event handler to the DOM content loaded event of the document object. Describe the current target property and prevent default method of the event objects. So some of the host objects in the browser environment: window and document you'll use a lot. The window is the actual window on the screen. The document is the HTML document that you're working on. So that's why you see document get element by ID. You're looking into that document to get that element out of there by ID. When you hear DOM, that's just the document object model. It's how things are set up. The window is a global object for JavaScript. Pretty much you got the window alerts and all that kind of stuff that pop up. That's from all that. Navigator contains information about the browser. Now that most browsers are becoming universal, you don't need that as much to check and see what browser the user's using. It used to be in the day you had to check and see if they're using IE or Netscape or whatever to write your code to properly function with whatever browser they're using. It's not as much nowadays since everything's kind of getting universal. And then history contains the URLs that a user has visited in the browser. Sometimes that's useful if you want to create your own like back button or something like that. You can use that history to kind of traverse through the websites people have visited. Some of the JavaScript native objects: object, the base object that all other JavaScript objects inherit. An array, an object that stores a collection of data. A date, an object that stores a date. Function, an object that stores a predefined collection of JavaScript statements. Number object, a wrapper object for working with primitive numbered data types. String object, a wrapper object for working with primitive string data types. Boolean, a wrapper object for working with primitive Boolean data types. And then math, a utility object with static methods for working with math. Some of the math ones are like floor and round and stuff like that to deal with some of the math methods and that. How a number object wraps a primitive number, a statement that creates a number variable. And this is no different than anything we've been doing. They create a constant give it the name of pi, assign it the value of 3.14159, and then it uses this next statement, a statement that uses a method of the number object. So they do alert pi, which is that 3.14159 that got created above. They do that dot to fixed, and we've been doing that to fixed, and what's that do?
Just round stuff off.
Yeah, it cuts the decimal points down to 2 places, and then we'll round it if needed. We've been using that quite a bit as we've been doing some of these calculations for our future values and stuff like that and whatnot. Terms related to objects, you got objects, properties, method, host object, native object, wrapper object, utility object. Another method of the window object that displays a dialog box is a confirm, and we've used that already a few times. Confirm, you just put whatever your message is inside there. An example here, how to use a dialog box to confirm an operation. Again, they create a constant variable, call it confirm delete. That variable is to assign the value of a confirm dialog box. Are you sure you want to delete the item? That's the string that they mention here. If confirm delete, and that if confirm delete just says if they click on that OK button, then run the code that deletes the item. And like I said, we've been, I don't know, have we used confirm boxes yet in any of our labs? I can't remember.
I don't think so.
Yeah, I don't either. I know we've used prompts, but I didn't know about the confirm. But hey, that's how you do a confirm. Declare it, give it a name, assign it to confirm object there, and then the parameter for the string that you want to put in there. Do an if just to see which button they click on. If confirm delete means they're OK and clicking on the OK button, and then it'll run whatever code you have in there. Global functions for parsing numbers, parse int, parse float. We've been working with these for a while. Parse int, you're not looking for a decimal point. That parse float looks for a decimal point. How to convert strings to numbers. Let entry A equal prompt. Enter any value. Here they're doing 12345.6789. Entry A. They do that parse int on entry A. Entry A was 12345.6789 with that parse int. Again, they chop that decimal point off at the end, and that value ends up being 12345. With the parse float, they leave that decimal point in there, and then it ends up being that 12345.6789. So that's the difference. That parse int goes up to the decimal point and chops everything off. Parse float takes the whole number itself, even with the decimal point and everything after. Like I said, we've been using that for a bit now. Some of that parse int stuff and even parse float we used in C# a little bit. 3 methods of the document object: query selector all, and then write. We've been using the write quite a bit, especially when we print HTML out to the screen. Dominic, you and I were messing with that a little bit yesterday on one of those labs. Document.write just writes it out to the screen. The query selector will go find a selector in your code and pull it. It's almost like a document.get element by ID. Instead, they use a query selector, and the query selector all will grab all of the same type of query selectors. So a common way to code selectors: select by element by ID. This is what we've been doing already a little bit. So what they do, this returns the object for the HTML element whose ID is rate. So they create a variable, a constant, give it the name of rate, and then assign it the value of document.querySelectorRate. So this query selector goes out and looks for whatever you're telling it to. Here, again, with that pound sign, it's saying go look for an ID, just like when we were doing CSS. You had an ID, a class, and the element itself. ID, class, yeah, element itself. That's all this query selector is doing. It's saying with that pound sign in front of it, saying go out and find an ID with the name rate in it. And then you could do a dot value at the end and it'd pull the value back for you. Here they're doing it by element type. So they're doing a constant, naming it links, assign it the value of document.query selector all. Query selector all goes out and looks for all your anchor tags. And then you can do whatever you want to with them, whether it be style them or something like that. But that's what that's doing. It goes out and finds all your anchor tags and you can do whatever you're going to with them. And then selecting by class, they create a constant, name it errors, assign it the value of document.query selector all. This goes out and looks for all the classes with the name error. And again, you know it's a class because of that period in front, just like it was with CSS. Same thing, the pound sign is your ID. The element itself is just the name of the element. If that was a P, it would be pulling all the paragraphs. If it was an H1, it would pull all the H1s. And this one here is the period is pulling the class. So any class with the name of error, you'd be able to access it using that query selector all. And you can use this query selector up here. You can pull an element up there with just that, a single element. A little bit more to it just because you're using multiple elements. You know, you could have multiple anchors or multiple paragraphs, so there's a little bit more to it when you pull it like that. Common way to code selectors using a descendant selector. And this is what I was kind of talking about here, where you could do a little bit more to pull out what you need if you're doing it a little bit different. So you can create a variable called constant, a type of constant, name it H2s, do a document.query selector all. You're getting an ID of FAQs, and then any H2 that goes with it. Combination selector, return an array of all the div elements assigned to the closed class. So they create a constant variable, name it minus, assign it to value document.query selector all. They're looking for a div with the class of closed, and then pull that. And using multiple selectors, returns any array of elements specified by two descendant selectors. And again, this just goes back to the CSS stuff that we had learned. So as we traverse through this DOM eventually, the document object model, that's what you're going to be doing, is pulling these elements, whether it be by the element itself, and I keep saying pull, but it just means go get it, to access it, to do something with it. So when I say pull, that's what I mean, is just you're going to go access it and do something with it more than likely if you're going to access it. So here they have a constant, name it elements, give it the value document.query selector all, go find an ID of FAQs with H2 and the div with a paragraph under it, and then go get that and do what you need to do to manipulate it and change it how you want to change it. How to write a line of HTML into a document, we've seen this already. Dominic, that's what you and I worked on a little bit yesterday, writing that one out to the page. Just document.write, documents the object, it's the document object. It's using the write method of the document object, and then you just put in your parameter, which is the bold tag, welcome to our website. You can put an H1 in there, H2, H3, you can put a paragraph in there, anything you want, and it writes it out to the page in HTML. And there are times where you may go do a document get element by ID, you get that ID, And based on the ID or however they're calling it, or an if statement you have set up, you may do a document.write and write some HTML code on the fly to have it do something based on what the user selects or responds to a prompt or something like that. HTML tags that define two text boxes. We've already worked with text boxes. We got an input, type text, give it an ID of first name, another one, input type text, ID sales amount. Some methods and property of text boxes, focus and select. Focus sets it to it, select selects it. Properties, value, disabled, so you can get the value out of a text box. You can disable a text box. And a method of a number object, and again we saw this toFix, we've been using that for a while. Just tell it how many places you want it to round it off after the decimal point. How to use the value property to get the current value from a text box. We've been doing this a little bit already. So without chaining, they create a variable type of let, give it a value or a name, first name, the value they assign to it is document.query selector. So they're going out and looking for, what are they looking for with the pound sign? Yep, looking for an ID called first name. And here you can see we created that text box with the first name. So they're going out, getting that. Then they take first name, which they declared up here. Now they're taking that first name variable and assigning that first name dot value. Occasionally you'll see code like this. It's a little bit of extra typing. More often than not, you'll see it with chaining, to where they declare the constant first name, and that first name equals that document.query selector. They go get the element, or I mean the ID first name, and get the value from it. Chaining is what you'll see more often, just because it's shorter, quicker to write, and it's doing the exact same thing as this without chaining, just a little less steps. How to use the parse float method to get a number from value from a text box. We've been working with this already. So declare a variable type let, give it a name sales amount, assigning it the value of document.query selector, go out, get the ID sales amount, and again without chaining. Without chaining just means they have to keep rewriting the variable name and assigning values to it to get it to where they want it to be at. So they declare it up here, then they assign it this document query selector. Then they take this sales amount from the query selector, get the value off of it. Then they reassign it again and do a parse float sales amount. So if it has a decimal space in it, it'll show the decimal space. If you do a parse int there, it will lose your decimals. So if you have money, you got $50.33, that parse float will return $50.33. If you use that parse int, your $50.33 will just come back as $50 because it chops the decimal point and everything after it off. With chaining, it's doing the same thing here. They create a constant called sales amount, assign it a parse float. Parse float, they're getting a document query selector, going out and getting that ID sales amount and the value off of it. So chaining cuts off 2 steps of having to write all that out. So a little bit of time saver, a little bit cleaner. You can kind of should be able to know what's going on when you look at it with chaining. Other examples of chaining. Here they create a constant, name it sales amount, assign it the value of a parse float. They go with document.query selector, go get that sales amount value. Then at the end they end that toFixed in, so if for some reason you return $50.333 it will get rid of that last 3, see if it needs to round up or not, and then it'll end up being $50.33. I don't know what you would do, maybe some kind of average or something to put on extra change, but that might have been a bad example, but anyhow, you get what I'm trying to say. Here they do a document query, select their first name, value, assign it a blank, so no value to it technically, and then a document.query, select their first name.focus. So if the page loads or something happens, the focus gets set on that text box with the value or the ID of first name. How to create a JavaScript object. This goes back to our C# days using that new keyword there. So we create a constant variable, give it the name of variable name, and you give it whatever variable name you want, equals, and then new, and that keyword new again, just like C#, saying we're creating an object here. We're going to use an object, so we create a new, and then whatever object type we use. In this example here, they do constant variable with the name today equals new. You see that new and you're like, okay, here comes the object, and date is the object that they're creating, that new object right there. You may see string and some stuff like that. You see date quite a bit when you're using date. Trying to think of what are some examples might be. The book might have some more examples in there for it. But you see date a lot in JavaScript with the object like that, creating a new object. Some methods of the date object: toDate string, get full year, get date, get month. Date toString just puts it in a string value for you. Get full year pulls the year. Get date gets the date, and then a get month will get the month for you. So if you have a date object and you only want the month, you do this get month. And here they kind of show you examples that use a date object. Here they have a constant variable, name it today, give it the value, and again here's that new keyword. So you know this is going to be an object. They're using the date object. And this date object, since they created it, it's called today. So today, they got toDate string. This toDate string is a method, and we know that because of the parentheses behind it there. Today is our object. toDate string is our method, and there's a parentheses in case you want to put parameters or something in there. Another one is today get full year, today get date, and today get month. And let's take a quick look at that. That's not what I want. We'll call this. What's that? No, you don't have to. I'm just going to give you an example on this. I'm recording a video. Once it's out there, you can go back and look at that if you want to. So you can see So first alert comes up today, get date as a string, and the date Tuesday, July 9th, 2024. We'll hit OK and it should pop our next alert up. So here we get full year using the method get full year, and it will show us the full year but nothing else, because all we're using is that get full year method from the date object to show us the year. Next one should be the date, which is 9th, and today is July 9th, and the get month, and it'll probably show 6th. And the way the months run, it's like an array of months, so they're one behind, so it's 7 technically, but it'll be 6. If we go get the month for June, it would show up as 5. If we got January, it'd be 0, and that's just because of the way the elements are getting pulled out of that array. And that should be the end of it. So that's how the date works. Some of that date object and a couple of its methods work like that. Some properties and method of the string object. One property is length. We use length on arrays mostly so far, but you can use them on these string objects. It'll tell you how many characters are in the string. A few methods of the string object. You got index of, substring, substring, 2 lowercase and 2 uppercase. The index of, you tell it what to search for and the position that you want it to look in. And I'll run some of these in a minute. Substring, tell it where to start and the length that you want it to go, the start and the stop. And I don't know if it's this example or the next chapter maybe. That gives a little bit of better examples of using some of the string object stuff. 2 lowercase and 2 uppercase, we've done some of this stuff already in C#. So examples that use a string object, they have a constant, they give it the name, assign it the value of Grace Hopper, and putting into parentheses shows that it's a string. Here they have a constant, name upper. They take that name Grace Hopper to uppercase. It just makes everything uppercase. Here they do a constant, name length, and then they do the name, the length, and the name length is 12. So if you count this out, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. There's 12 spaces in this Grace Hopper name, and that's what that length comes back is 12. I do a constant, give it the name index of, and what it does here is saying go look for a space in this Grace Hopper name. It goes out and it says 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and comes up to the space, and so it gives an index of 5 for that. First name, substring 0, and index. So what they're saying is start from 0 and go to the index and pull the name. I'm surprised it doesn't show Grace on there, but it probably should show Grace since that's what they're doing there. But they didn't. I'll see if I can find my better examples today. If not, I'll cover them real quick tomorrow, just to show you some more of the string objects. And that you will probably use a lot of this string object stuff when you do JavaScript, whether it be how you set up a text box or something and pull names or values out of text boxes or anything like that. So you'll probably end up using these string objects quite a bit and the methods that go with them. So be nice to try and get familiar with that. Terms related to specific objects, you got a global object, document object, text box object, number object, method function chaining, data object, string object, and a constructor. The syntax for a function declaration, and these are like methods that we did in C#, Java, they call them methods. JavaScript, they call them functions. They all pretty much the same thing. I think I've told the story a couple times about I always did front end, so I always called them functions working with JavaScript. When I first started working with Java, I was talking to a more senior developer than myself, and I kept calling them functions. And working with Java, they're called methods. And oh, he let me know. He got mad, and he's like, why do you keep calling them functions? When we work in Java, they are known as methods. And I'm like, functions, methods, same thing. You know what I'm talking about. But he made a big deal about it, so that always kind of stuck with me. So I kind of say the same thing now for some reason. But I don't know. It's not a big deal. It is, I guess, but not, because it's the same thing. Anyhow, declare your function just like you do your variable type. Instead of a constant or a let, we use the keyword function there to say that it's going to be a function. Give our function a name. If we need any parameters, we put it into parentheses after the function name. If there are no parameters, you still have to put the parentheses, but you just don't put anything in there. You got an open curly bracket and a closed curly bracket, and your statement that runs when that function gets called all goes in between those curly brackets. It can be a one-line thing like an alert, or it can be hundreds of lines for the actual function to do quite a bit of stuff. But it all goes in between these parameter or the curly brackets, squiggly brackets, when you actually call your function. A function declaration with no parameters that doesn't return a value. Like I said, see, they declared a function to let you know it's going to be a function. They give it that name, a show year. There are no parameters with it, so you still have to put the parentheses, but you just don't put anything in there. And then you write your code into curly brackets that you want to work when the function's called. Here they create a constant variable, name it today. Again, there's that keyword new, so they know you're using a date object there. And then they just throw an alert. The year is today, get full year. And then your function call, just like C# when we called the method, you call the function the same way. You just use the function name and the parenthesis to run it. If you pass parameters in there, you can put your parameters in there to pass them through into your function. A function declaration with one parameter that returns a DOM, document object model element. So you do a function, $, and whatever selector. And then because they have it set up this way, they're returning this document.query selector and the selector in there. So that just goes out and returns DOM object, document object model element, whatever you're calling through there.
Mr. G.
Yep.
I got a question. So a function and method are kind of the same thing. I know you said last semester a lot of us struggle with methods, but how do you struggle if we kind of just did the same thing with function? Well, we kind of do the same thing with function, but
well, a lot of people struggle because they'd never used a method or a function before.
I thought they did when before C# though.
If they took the HTML, CSS, and JavaScript class, they are all right calling a method or a function as long as there's no parameters, because we don't pass, in this class, we don't pass many parameters through our methods or functions. So they did all right until we started passing a lot of parameters through, and once we started passing parameters through, it kind of threw everybody off because they did not do much of it, if any at all, in this class.
Okay.
So yeah, that's where they were cruising along, and we got to that point. That's when they started to stumble a little bit with keeping up and getting their stuff done with it. So how to call the function, you just do a constant email, $email1.value. That's what you're doing up here. You got the function, you're doing it, and you're calling it here. Function declaration with two parameters that returns a value. So you have your function keyword there to let it know it's going to be a function. You got your function name, which is the calculate tax, and you're passing two parameters, which is going to be a subtotal and a tax rate. So inside your function, our curly brackets here, declaring a constant variable, giving it the name of tax, and assigning it the value of subtotal times the tax rate. And then you're going to return the tax to fixed and round it off to 2 decimal places. So how to call that function then is you create a constant subtotal, give it $85, tax rate of 5%, and then here they create a constant, call it sales tax, and then in the sales tax they actually call the function there that calculate tax. Up here they're calling the function, they're passing in the two parameters, subtotal and tax rate. Here's where they get that subtotal value, here's where they get that tax rate value. Those numbers just plug in here, and this alert actually calls the method because it's calling the sales tax. So when it calls the sales tax, it goes up here, gets this calculate tax, runs, and this alert will return what your tax is, the .to fixed. So what it does, it takes this 85 and this 0.05, it replaces that name there and this name here with these values and then passes them through here. So then it takes that 85, puts it here, that tax rate of 05 in there, gives you your answer, and this alert puts it out to the screen so you can see it. So just like working with functions or methods in C#, doing the exact same thing. The syntax for a function expression, you have a constant, the constant name, the function, and the parameters, and a statement that runs when the function is executed. When you're setting up functions, they'll always be pretty much, I shouldn't say will be, because there's a little bit different ways of setting them up in JavaScript, but most of the time you'll have something to do with the function here, whether it be the name, or here they're just calling the function. Your parameters in the parentheses, or no parameters, but you still have to have the parentheses, and then followed by the curly brackets and the code that you want to run when you do it. So in this next thing, function expression with no parameters that doesn't return a value. So they're saying create a variable called a constant variable, name it show year, and say run a function. They're not really giving the function a name, but the show year gets assigned that value of the function. So then they're saying here's the function, no parameters to it, got our curly brackets, and then they put all the code that we want to run in those curly brackets. So they're just creating a constant variable, calling it today, assigning it, what's that new mean?
Makes a new object.
Yep, it's going to be an object. So when we see new, we know it's going to create a new object. We're using the date object here in this case. And then so we have the alert, the year is, and they're doing this today, which is the name of the object they create, and doing the get full year method for it. And then they call the show year, they use that constant name up here, show year, in the parentheses to run that function. And so that's how that works. A function expression with no parameters that doesn't return a value. So if you see function expression, that's what's going on there, compared to a normal function. Did I miss it? A normal function declaration. And then a function expression, which is that there. Here's a function expression with one parameter. It returns a DOM object. So we're doing a constant using a $sign. Doing this function, I'm going to use a selector, return document.query selector, whatever selector it is. Selector ends up being an ID email 1, and they get the value off of it. So that's returning this DOM element. So they're pulling a value out of a text box, more than likely, is what's going on with that there. Function expression with two parameters that returns the value. And again, this is just like the calculate tax one we did up here. This is just a regular function declaration here. Back in the old days, this is how you usually saw it written out. I don't know if it's still quite like that today, how much it's evolved into this declaration. This function expression, so they're doing a constant, they're calling it calculate tax. They're saying this is going to be a function with two parameters, a subtotal and a tax rate. They do the calculations here. And again, same as we saw before, they do a constant, name it subtotal, give it that value of 85, constant, name it tax rate, give it the value of 0.05. Then here's where we call that function, this constant sales tax. That sales tax calls this calculate tax. They assign it this function that we created up here. And it's saying pass the subtotal and tax rate into it. Again, that subtotal is 85, the tax rate is 0.05. That goes up here into our function that we created. That subtotal here gets replaced with this 85 that we're passing in. The tax rate here gets replaced with this 0.05 that we just passed in. It does its calculations and it gives us a tax with 2 decimal points. The alert runs and then it prints out what that sales tax is from our calculate tax method that we just called here. That makes sense? Syntax for an arrow function, and we looked at an arrow function quite a few chapters earlier. Kind of odd to have it that early in our labs and stuff, but we don't get to it until now. But what they do is they have a constant, give it the name constant name, or whatever name you want to give it, and equals, and then you got the parameters that you want to pass in. If you don't want to pass in any parameters, you just have to put the parentheses there. And I think that was the example we used in one of our labs or homework, as there wasn't anything that we were passing in as a parameter. Then you use the equal greater than sign to make it look like that arrow. You got your squiggly brackets, curly brackets, and then your code that runs in between them. Like I said, when you're setting up a function, I want to call it a method. When you set up a function, however you decide you want to run it or call it, set it up, any code that you want to run from that function has to go in between these curly brackets. So if it's outside that curly bracket, it will not run with that function call when you actually call it. So the code for a function expression, and this is the one we just took a look at. Constant, calculate tax. They're saying it's going to be a function. Here's the parameters we're passing. Here's the code we want to execute when that function runs. It's rewritten as an arrow function here. So now we do just like up top here, declare the constant, give it the name calculate tax, just like we did here. Now in the parentheses though, we put our subtotal and tax rate in there. Use our arrow curly brackets, and then our code that we want to run. So the big difference here is we don't have the function keyword like it is up here, but we still have our parentheses with the parameters we're passing through. The function expression doesn't have the arrow sign here like it does below, but they both again have the curly brackets with the code in it that they want to run. So a little bit of a change. I don't know, does it save time? Yeah, I guess it maybe saves a little bit of time, but whatever you're comfortable with, whatever the labs ask for, that's what you want to use. They seem to really be pushing these two a lot, so I'm guessing nowadays the actual function declaration doesn't get used as much, but to me, that's what I had always done old school wise, but it seems like they're really showing the arrow function and the function expression quite a bit, so I'm guessing that's more of the popular way nowadays to be writing the code. I know you'll see the arrow function quite a bit nowadays. Arrow function with one parameter. Constant calculate tax. The subtotal is the parameter. Doing the arrow, getting that subtotal. They already have that rate in there, so we don't have to worry about passing that through. Arrow function with one parameter executes one statement. And because there's only one statement, one line of statement, you can put it with no curly brackets behind it. But it's nice to get in the habit of using those curly brackets because most of the time you're going to be using more than one line of code. But whatever you're comfortable with, as long as you don't keep getting a lot of errors coding it out for forgetting something or not doing what you're supposed to do. An arrow function with no parameters executes one statement. So technically, because there's no parameter in it, you just have to have the parentheses, get your arrow call there, and then you can just do a document.location.href. So a little bit easier, cleaner here with just the one line of code compared to doing the two lines. But again, it's up to you how you want to do it, whatever you're more comfortable with, whatever is easier for you to understand as you go back and look through your code. Set it up however you want. And then how you call an arrow function, you just declare a variable type constant, give it a variable name, and then the equal sign means you're assigning it a value, you're assigning it, and you just assign it that get current URL, which is the name of the function we created here, and then the parentheses again to call that function. So that's how you call an arrow function. You just call it in your code, so you can then do an alert the URL, and then it would print out the current URL for you on the screen or on a box. You could do a write, document.write, and have it print out if you want it to print out onto the screen. Terms related to functions, function, calling or invoking a function. You hear it said both ways, so if you hear anybody in the workforce saying invoking, that means they're just calling the function. Function declaration, parameter, an argument. Parameter is what's going in, an argument's what you're passing into it. Passing parameters, return statement, hoisted, function expression, arrow function, and arrow operator. Hoisted, it's just the way it gets run. We talked about that a few chapters back. I forgot what we were covering then. I think that's when we were first getting into JavaScript and how it gets run by the time the page loads and everything like that. The value it brings back when you actually call it and when it's used. Two global variables, var tax rate, adds tax rate property to the window object. Let tax equals 0, doesn't add anything to the window object. Alert, window.taxRate displays 0.075, window.tax displays undefined. Usually for a global variable, you'll use var. This let tries to keep it to like a block element level to where you won't override it. That's the whole purpose of that let, is to try and keep it from being overwritten in your code. This var tax rate, you can use it more often in your code, but you'll be overriding that value there. That let tries to keep you from overriding that value, so they try and limit it to where you can use it. So that's why you'll get this undefined when you run this alert window.tax using it as a global variable. Function that uses the global variables, here they have a variable or a variable type constant. They give it the name calculate tax, assign it subtotal, so that's the parameter they're passing in, as that subtotal is the parameter. We saw that on one of the examples earlier. Arrow function, and then our curly brackets just saying tax equals subtotal times tax rate, tax to a fixed amount. You can see in the global part up here, we called this tax rate 0.075, so we know this tax rate's already going to have a value of 0.074. I think I said 74, because it's a global variable. Because it's a global variable, it can be used anywhere in your code, and so that's why we can get that tax rate out and have it work. Calculate tax, they're calling that method, that function, calculate tax. This 100 is the subtotal that's getting passed back into the function, and here they're alerting out this tax and having to display 0.74. This tax, they declare it up here with this value 0. Because they're trying to use it up here, it won't work. In this function, it works down in here. And then when we pass it out to the thing, it will work now. A function that uses local variables and constants. We've been working mostly with local variables. So here you have a constant. They name it calculate tax. Passing a parameter of subtotal and tax rate in, because we know the parentheses are before this arrow sign. It has some stuff in it, so they're passing those parameters in. Constant named tax equals subtotal times tax rate. They're going to return the tax rate. This is the same example we've been looking at this whole time. Here outside the parentheses or the curly brackets, they're doing a constant tax calculate. So they're calling the method now. They're passing in 100 as the subtotal and 0.074 as the tax rate, and then they alert that tax. Here's a function with 2 loops. They're calling a function named local, not passing any parameters in. Here they're using that keyword function, so you know it's going to be a function. The name of it's local, parentheses with nothing in it means they're not passing any parameters in. It's just a for loop, so they're doing a var I, and again here they do a let, so that var is function scope. It's in the function, it stays in the function. This let here is in the block scope. Because it's out here and not inside of here, it's going to throw an error and say that it cannot find it. It's going to give you a reference error because it's looking at it in the block, and that's technically considered the block because this is function scope and it's in the function. It will find this and display the 5 or whatever it's supposed to show. This one here, since it's not technically in the block, it will not find it and you'll get a reference error. So if you hear something with block scope, that's what they're talking about. The block is like that chunk of code right there in your parentheses or your curly brackets or whatever it is. Terms related to scope, you got scope, global variable, global constant, local variable, local constant, function scope, and block scope. And again, function scope we got the function, we got our brackets. So that's the function scope is in between there. And then the block scope is, even though this is in the function, we have our little block of code that we want to run with this for loop. So for it to work in block scope, it'd have to be inside these curly brackets. This alert is not inside those curly brackets, so it cannot find that variable j in the block scope. So that's why it's given this reference error. Common events, window load. You'll see some stuff where you're waiting for the window to load, and you can do like window.load. Document, you can do this document content loaded. What that's doing is waiting for all the content in the DOM, the document object model, to load. Once that loads, then it usually will run a function or do some kind of event once everything's loaded. I think we may have used that a couple times in the lab already. Control, you got focus, blur, change, select. So if it gets the focus, it will do something. A blur means something changes. Change and a select if you select something. Element is a click, a double click, a mouse over, mouse in, mouse out. Those are pretty self-explanatory. Double click is just double clicking your mouse. If your mouse hovers over something, or mouse goes into something, or mouse comes out of something, it'll fire off an event. The syntax for the add event listener method. So you have your event target, add event listener, and then the parameters you're going to pass in since it's a method. So that's the event name and the event handler function. So here, event handler named join list, so they create a constant, give it the name of join list. They're going to run a function here, but there's no parameter, so we just put the parentheses, our arrow function, and then our curly brackets to actually run the code, and then the statement for the function goes in there. How to attach an event handler to the click event. So here we have a submit button. It goes and gets this ID for the submit button. Add event listener. We want it to go listen for that click. So when it do click on it, whatever it ends up being, which happens to be the submit button with the ID, it fires off our method, our event handler function, join list. So then it run this join list, so you'd see an alert pop up that says statement for the function goes here. How to attach an event handler to the double click event of a text box. So just here you have the text box. It's going out and getting the ID from that text box 1. We're adding an event listener to it. And that add event listener method, it's saying when we double click on it, run our join list method function that we created up here. And then remove event listener kind of does the opposite, removes the event listener, the event name, and the handler. You don't see this one used that much. You definitely see the add event listener a lot because you're setting clicks and double clicks and stuff like that. You may use one of these in a lab, maybe, I don't remember. Code that handles the DOM, content loaded, the document. When you see DOM, it just means document object model. And again, that document object model is your HTML page, how it's set up. So it's looking through all your elements, your classes, your IDs, and that kind of stuff is what it actually does. So it sets it all up. Once it's loaded, so you create it, you do this document add event listener, you put the document content loaded in here, and then once it loads, it will fire off your function. Your function in this case is show message. There is no parameters we're passing through, and then we have the alert. So once that DOM content all loads, it will fire off your function called show message and pop that up. Using an anonymous function as the event handler, you can just do a document.addListener, tell it wait until the DOM content's loaded, and then once it loads, fire off our function, anonymous function, because there is no name or anything associated with it. It says just fire off this function, and our function happens to be alert the DOM is ready. And again, here's the arrow function being used. The arrow function is in this gray part, if I can get it without. In the gray section there, that's our arrow function. But since there's no name, as you can see, the show message up here is the actual name. There is no name here, so it's considered an anonymous function because it's just saying run this function, do what it's saying to do, which is that alert DOM is ready. Code that attaches a click event handler for a button when the DOM is loaded. I know we'll use this a lot in our labs coming up and stuff like that. So this one here, using a named function as the event handler. Here's our function, and it's named because we give it a name. We declare it a constant type, give it a name, and it's the arrow function because we got our little arrow function here. We got our parentheses there saying we're not passing any parameters into it, and then whatever code we put in between our curly brackets will fire. So we do a document.addListener. The listener that we want to add to it is going to be this DOM content loaded. It's saying fire a function off. That function is then going to go out, grab this calculate ID, and then they're adding an event listener to that, looking for this click event. And then once that click event gets clicked, it fires off our process entry method up here. So it's almost like they're nesting in a function inside a function kind of a thing. So again, they have the document.addEventListener. That event listener that we're looking for first is making sure all of our page is loaded. So then once our page is loaded, it says load this next, the calculate event, add event listener, and wait until somebody clicks on this calculate button, and when they do, go ahead and fire off this process entry method that we created up here. You'll see this a lot, like I said, in our labs coming up. If you probably already used it a couple times in some of the labs, or may have seen it in some of the labs or in the book, but we'll be using that a lot more here coming up. Using an anonymous function as the event handler. So they're doing a document.eventListener DOM content loaded. Here's the arrow function. So they're saying take the document object, add this event listener method. Once the DOM content of your page is loaded, fire off this method. And this method will say go get the whatever has the ID of calculate, add an event listener to that ID, make that event listener a click event. When you click on this calculate, whatever has this calculate ID in it, fire off another function, and it's an anonymous function because it's not using a name. Here's using a name. That's using an anonymous function because there's no name associated with it, and then run our code. So that's the difference between using a name function and using an anonymous function. Name function has some kind of name with it, and an anonymous function just has the parentheses with the arrow to run it. That makes sense? Property and method of event object. Property is the current target. Method prevent default. Current target is whatever you're getting. The prevent default can keep certain things from happening. Trying to think of a good example. I'll have to go look up a good example, but prevent default, whatever the default is, it just prevents it from happening. So like on a button click, so if you're expecting a button click to work, you can use that prevent default and it will block your button click from actually working. So whatever the default is supposed to be, this will stop it from happening. So if you do a mouse over and do that prevent default, like mouse over or something like that, it will keep it from actually going. Common HTML elements that have default actions for the click event: an anchor, load the page or an image in an href attribute. Input, submit the form if the type attribute is set to submit. Input, reset the form if the type attribute is set to reset. Button, submit the form if the type attribute is set to submit, and reset the form if the type attribute is set to reset for the button. So that's what some of the click events do. Common stuff here. Everybody knows clicking on a button, clicking on a link. HTML form with the text box and a submit button. Of course, it's a form, so you got to start it with form and end it with form. An action, that means it's going to send it to a page called join.html. And the method is get, the way they're sending it. Input type text, given an ID of mail1 and a email1 and a name of email1, and then again the input type submit. ID is join list and the value is join list. An event handler for the click event of a submit button. So here they have a variable constant. They give it the name join list, and they're doing an event. If document.query selector ID email1 value is blank, they do notify the alert here that the email is required. Don't allow the form to be submitted. So this event.prevent default does not allow you to click on that button to send it back. So that's what that prevent default does. So if they don't have it filled out and still try and click the submit button or whatever, it stops it from allowing it to do that. Here they do document add event listener, DOM content load it. Once it loads, if they go out to this join list and add the event listener click, run it, run our method join list. Terms related to events: event handler, attach an event handler, anonymous function, and default action for an event. That's a default, and that's what this prevent default will stop there. Miles per gallon application in a browser. I'm not going to go too much into this. I think most of this is in your book. Take a quick look. Selector.query selector. So by using this line of code here, you can call this $sign and then gets it to do this query selector stuff. So that's what they're doing here, is using that $sign and using all this code to go with that $sign. $sign saying use the query selector. They're doing whatever this ID is going to be. That's the query selector you're using as this ID. Use the query selector, get that mile per gallon by the query selector ID. And again, here's that query selector, so they use that $sign for that. This $sign saying go out here, get the selector, whatever selector we're using. The selector we're using happens to be this ID called join list. On that ID join list, add an event listener, which is going to be a click. Somebody clicks on it, run this, and have it do all this stuff is what's going on. But that's all. Like I said, it's in the book. It's on these slides, so if you want to take a look at it, I think you're going to end up modifying some of these MPG applications you've worked on already in this email list. I think you have to modify it somewhat in these next coming labs and homework. So that's quick run through on the JavaScript objects, functions, and events. And like I said, we've used a lot of these in C#. If we haven't, we've already been using them in class, in the labs, and the homework. Any questions or comments or concerns about any of that? No? So I'll go ahead and stop the recording and turn you guys loose on the Chapter 4 homework.